It was morning in the Vatican, and the golden light of the Roman summer rested gently upon the columns of St. Peter's Square. The world went on with its ordinary rhythm, but within the sacred walls of Vatican City, something profound and irreversible was about to be announced. The bells of the basilica, which usually ring in harmony with the liturgical calendar, sounded outside their usual scheduled 3 long, measured tolls, as if something wished to be heard before it could be understood. The news spread like a breeze laced with mystery. His Holiness, Pope Leo XIV, would be making an unexpected announcement later that morning. The Catholic world, accustomed to the solemn and ceremonial pace of papal decisions, was caught off guard by the quiet urgency of the communiqué. It was not a doctrinal exhortation, nor was it a response to internal crises. It was, according to close sources, a gesture of hope, a decision made in the silence of prayer. At noon, when the Pope appeared on the inner balcony of the Clementine Hall accompanied only by a lit candle, a rustic wooden crucifix, and the Cardinal José Tolentino de Mendonça, the air seemed suspended. There were no printed speeches, no orchestra, no visual staging, only the sound of the wind passing through the open stained glass and the expectant silence of those who knew they were witnessing a historic moment. With a calm voice, yet marked by a loving gravity, Leo XIV began. Today, I do not announce an administrative appointment. Today, the Church consecrates a gesture of listening. In the face of a noisy world, we choose the poet. In the face of a fragmented culture, we choose the contemplative. In the face of a faith emptied of interiority, we choose the man who made silence a sacramental language. And then, with the simplicity that marks truly inspired acts, Pope Leo XIV announced that José Tolentino de Mendonça would not be just a collaborator. He would be the new prefect of the Congregation for Spiritual Culture and Interiority, a newly created dicastery established at that very moment, dedicated to the mission of recovering the mystical, contemplative and poetic dimension of the Christian faith. The appointment, however, was not the most impactful part. The Pope's gesture went beyond structure. He knelt before the new prefect and asked, in an audible voice, "Help us relearn how to listen to God deep in the soul." Tolentino, visibly moved, remained silent. He simply reached out his hand and touched the Pope's forehead. A gesture that was not a rite, it was a prayer. Leo XIV's decision was interpreted as the recognition of the spiritual urgency of our time. A time when faith runs the risk of becoming mere discourse, mere ideology, mere statistics. A time when temples are full, but hearts are empty. A time that needs less spectacle, and more silence. In the hours that followed, religious communities around the world began to react, but not with protests, not with applause. They reacted with vigils. Perpetual adoration chapels saw a sudden rise in attendance. Monasteries opened their doors for days of silence. On social media, people began to share excerpts from Tolentino's poetry, especially the one that says, "Prayer begins when the noise ends." Secular newspapers, usually critical of Vatican decisions, treated the gesture with unusual respect. An editorial in Le Monde stated, "The Church chose to listen to a poet. Perhaps there is still hope for the world." And this hope was not institutional. It was spiritual. At the Gregorian University, where Tolentino had studied in the 1990s, students spontaneously organized a night of spiritual readings, not to debate doctrines but to rediscover beauty. In Lisbon, the new prefect's hometown, church bells rang spontaneously in ancient parishes, not by episcopal decree, but at the initiative of the faithful. Leo XIV had once again surprised the world, but this time, not with a disciplinary measure, not with a bombastic document, but with a poetic gesture that paradoxically proved more ecclesial than many councils. By placing interiority at the center of the Church's mission, he did not weaken doctrine, he rooted it. He did not relativize the faith, he interiorized it. From that day on, the Vatican began to breathe differently. Instead of long speeches, the Pope began including pauses of silence in his audiences. Instead of administrative advice, he began proposing contemplative retreats to the cardinals. Instead of asking what should we do, he began to ask whom should we listen to. And it all began with a poet, with a gesture, with an appointment that was not merely hierarchical, it was prophetic. For centuries, the Church has tried to convince the world through reason, through morality, through numbers. Now, it was beginning again, through the Spirit, and perhaps that is exactly what the world most needs now. In the upcoming chapters, we will see how this decision unfolded in monasteries, in dioceses, and in hearts. How Leo XIV's gesture awakened a new spiritual cycle, and why poetry, silence, and listening have become the most powerful tools of the new evangelization. Because in the end, perhaps only a poet can translate what heaven is trying to say. For centuries, the Catholic Church has moved in a delicate balance between institutional rigidity and the intimate cry of the soul. While the Vatican has been the visible heart of the faith, poets, mystics, and contemplatives, often relegated to the margins, have carried the invisible veins of deep spirituality. And it was in this seemingly solid and predictable setting that a surprising decision came to shake not only the corridors of the Vatican, but also the invisible structures of sensitivity and hope. In a gesture few expected, Pope Leo XIV chose Cardinal José Tolentino de Mendonça to take on a new central role, not as an administrator, but as a prophet, not as a technocrat of faith, but as a poet of the sacred dot. It was morning in the Vatican when an official communique, personally signed by Leo XIV, was delivered to the Catholic press and read in Latin before an auditorium filled with cardinals, theologians, diplomats, and representatives of religious orders. The tone was solemn, but the content moved even the most rational among them. The time has come for the Church to listen again with the heart. I hereby appoint Cardinal José Tolentino de Mendonça as custodian of the silent word. His mission is not to govern, but to remind, not to legislate, but to inspire, not to systematize doctrine, but to rekindle in the heart of the Church the fire of the incarnate word that burns, but does not consume. His voice will not be heard from pulpits, but in the breath between the psalms. His authority will not be of imposition, but of beauty. The world was stunned. Never before in the modern history of the Church had such a symbolic function been created, so profoundly aesthetic, so oriented toward the spirit rather than power. The decision was interpreted by many as a silent spiritual revolution, a realignment of the Vatican's internal priorities, and, above all, a recognition that God's language before being theological is poetic. José Tolentino, known for his works that intertwine literature, spirituality, and compassion, received the news in silence. He withdrew for 2 days, in prayer in the small chapel of his convent in Lisbon before traveling to the Vatican. When he finally appeared before the cameras, he wore a simple white habit and held in his hands a book of poetry by Rilke and a rosary made of wood. It was not called to speak on behalf of the Church, he said calmly, but to listen with her to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. And that is exactly what began to happen with his new mission. Cardinal Tolentino received no office, no entourage, no state protocol. He was given a monastic cell within the Vatican gardens, where he would live in prayer, reading, and writing, accessible to any faithful soul who wished to speak with him. No agenda, no filters, no formalities, but the impact of his appointment was immediate. Bishops began quoting his poems in their homilies. Religious communities started meditating daily on excerpts from his letters. Young people, especially those distant from institutional faith, began to rediscover Catholic mysticism through Tolentino's gentle and provocative words. Seminaries, once focused almost exclusively on philosophy and dogmatic theology, began offering courses in literature, sacred art, and poetic contemplation. And most surprisingly, the corridors of the Curia, so often associated with bureaucracy and institutional weight, were now crossed by a new breeze, a breeze of lightness, of listening, of the unspoken. Priests said they began to pray differently, as if Tolentino's appointment had liberated a forgotten part of their priestly soul, as if, instead of merely repeating formulas, they could now sing them inwardly, weep inwardly, and allow the sacred to be not only proclaimed but felt. Pope Leo XIV, in a private audience with young theology students from the Pontifical Gregorian University, explained his choice with unexpected words. For a long time we've asked the faithful to understand doctrine. Now, I want them to hear the whisper of God. And the whisper does not always come through treatises. Sometimes, it comes through tears. The decision to appoint Tolentino as the custodian of the silent word was more than symbolic. It was prophetic. It marked the beginning of a new phase in the Church's life. A phase where the language of beauty, art, deep listening, and inner silence was once again recognized as a legitimate theological language. Monasteries around the world began organizing nights of mystical poetry. Churches reserved sacred spaces where artists could create before the altar. Altar servers were encouraged to play the guitar silently before the Blessed Sacrament as a form of contemplative prayer. And for the first time in a long time, the Church seemed to remember that before it is an institution, it is a mystery, and mysteries are not explained. They are embraced. In a later interview, Leo XIV was asked by a secular journalist whether he feared that choosing a poet for such a central figure might weaken the Church's image of authority, but his short reply was a theological earthquake. Whoever is afraid of poetry has already lost faith. In the following days, José Tolentino de Mendonça became one of the most searched names on the internet. His books sold out in bookstores across Europe and Latin America. But he, faithful to his mission, remained far from the headlines. He continued writing, in silence, beneath the shade of an olive tree in the Vatican gardens. What few knew was that, on the same day he assumed his new role, Tolentino composed a poem dedicated to Pope Leo XIV, handwritten on a sheet of recycled paper. The poem, now lovingly preserved in the Pope's private library, ended with these verses: "There are decisions that are not made with the mind, but with the tears the soul has held for centuries. And there are popes who do not govern the world. They simply listen to heaven and obey. There was no decree, no papal bull, not even an official press release. And yet, the world felt it in the air, felt it in the spirit, felt it in the most hidden silence of the soul. Pope Leo XIV's decision to entrust José Tolentino de Mendonça with the mission of re-enchanting the word, as he himself whispered before the cardinals, was not an administrative act. It was a sacramental one. At a time when the language of faith seemed to echo no longer. When homilies had become technical and sacred words often emptied of anointing, Tolentino's choice was like placing poetry back inside theology, like reminding the church that before it is understood, the truth must be contemplated. And that's why the fruits began to appear. Not in reports, not in headlines, but on forgotten altars, in reopened hearts, in tears that fell without explanation at the sound of a single phrase, read, written, or recited with soul. Because José Tolentino didn't write with a pen, he wrote with a bent knee. The new council for sacred language, now under his leadership, wasn't born to produce documents but to reignite flames. It brought together contemplative poets, monks with literary gifts, translators of silence, and mystics of the word. People who had been forgotten by a noisy world, but who were now returning to the center. And something began to happen slowly, invisibly, profoundly. Masses began to include longer pauses, homilies now written from prayer, not technique. Seminary formation was reformed, not with more books, but with more hours of adoration. The liturgy gained space to breathe. Sacred music became prayer once again, and on social media, quotes from Tolentino began circulating with more strength than religious headlines. One echoed like a seed. Before you speak about God, drink of him. That was what the new pope asked of the church, and it was what Tolentino began to repeat in silence with his life. Dioceses began to report a phenomenon. Young people who had previously rejected faith were returning, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of thirst. A thirst for something that made sense, without losing the mystery. And that something came through the living word. The word that bleeds, the word that kneels. In Lisbon, a secular university invited Tolentino for a conference. Instead of giving a lecture, he simply read a poem and remained silent for 6 minutes. At the end, no one applauded, no one spoke, but many cried. It was as if time had stopped, and for the first time in decades, the soul had found a language that did not wound aunt in the Holy Land. Nuns reported dreaming of his writings read aloud by children's voices. In Tokyo, a hidden chapel was reopened after a former atheist translated his meditations into Japanese. And in the Philippines, a 9-year-old girl, upon hearing one of his prayers read by her grandfather, said, "This isn't just beautiful, it's true." Yes, truth began to shine again, not through force but through beauty. When Leo XIV entrusted this mission to Tolentino, he wasn't simply recognizing a literary talent, he was building an altar inside language. He was telling the world that the word before it is dogma, is gift, that before it is understood it must be contemplated, and that the church, to become light again, must relearn how to speak, through tears, not through slogans. And so, without needing to change doctrine, the Pope changed the tone, and the tone changes everything. You've made it this far, not by accident. Did you feel something in this video? Then don't ignore it. Maybe God is calling you back. Maybe he is just whispering. Read it again, but this time, on your knees. Comment below, "Lord, teach me to hear your word with my heart." Share this video with someone who needs to rediscover the beauty of faith. Subscribe and turn on notifications so that the next message may find you, even in the silence. Because sometimes it is in the silence that the word speaks again. And when it speaks, everything can begin again.